Great. Well, thanks so much for agreeing to talk to me about your new paper. So first, maybe if you can just give me a little bit of info about who you are and where you're based at the moment.
Yes, so first of all, thank you very much for inviting me. My name is Caroline Reichert. I'm a psychologist, so I studied psychology, and then after my diploma, I went to sleep research and chronobiology. And now I'm a postdoc and deputy head at the Center for Chronobiology in Basel in Switzerland, which is headed by Professor Christian Kajochen. Yes, and I'm very much interested in adenosine and caffeine and how they affect the sleep-wake system, and also in this interaction between sleep homeostasis and circadian rhythms. So this is basically what I'm focusing on.
Great.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So maybe, so you can give us perhaps a bit of a background to the motivation for this paper particularly. So it was looking at the effects of caffeine on sleep and circadian timing in male adolescents. And it was a randomized crossover trial. So sort of, what was your motivation for starting the study?
Yes, so basically the reason was that on the one hand, we know that caffeine intake is very frequent in teenagers, and that also advertisements of energy drinks, for instance, particularly target this age group of young adults and teenagers, and that teenagers also suffer from insufficient sleep often. And on the other hand, we realized that there is no systematic experimental investigation which focuses or which investigates systematically the effects of caffeine on sleep-wake regulation of teenagers. And this actually was the reason to look at this.
Great, okay. And so can you then just give us a little bit of a background on what you did in the study?
Yes, of course. So we did a randomized placebo crossover trial. So we asked our participants to ingest caffeine in the evening after a week of abstinence. And this was 80 milligram of caffeine, so the dose which is corresponding to the dose in small cans of energy drinks, 250 milliliter out, or placebo. And then we measured subjective sleepiness, for instance, but also melatonin and subjective sleep quality and sleep. Yes, and what we found was kind of probably not surprising. So as we assumed, subjective sleepiness was reduced. The participants felt less sleepy after caffeine, and had also worse subjective sleep quality, particularly regarding sleep latency. And also the percentage of slow wave sleep was reduced after caffeine compared to placebo. Surprisingly, however, we could not observe this typical reduction of melatonin secretion in the evening hours after caffeine compared to placebo.
Okay, so is that something that has been shown in other studies then, the reduction of melatonin?
Yes, so actually in adults there are probably 5 studies showing that there's a typical melatonin suppression and also delay of dim light melatonin onset after caffeine intake in the evening after a phase of abstinence. And actually we were quite sure to see this as well in our data, and that we could probably argue, caffeine intake also delays the teenagers even more than they are already. But actually this was not the case. And then we also did exploratory analysis to find out why there is this difference to earlier studies. And what our analysis suggests so far is that it was actually, the dose was actually too low. So that we administered a lower relative dose compared to the body weight of the participants than earlier studies in adults did. And that the relative dose is actually associated with the probability to observe a delay in the dim light melatonin onset after caffeine intake.
Okay. And so in terms of the dose, does that relate to how much caffeine teenagers are sort of taking on a daily basis, or is it sort of more or less?
Yeah, so what we know from surveys is that around 80% of teenagers consume caffeine, but the amount they consume actually is quite different per survey or per nation. So it ranges from 40 milligram to 350 milligram even per teenager, which would correspond to around 3.5 cups of coffee around. So this is very, very different, I think, also in different nations. Yes.
Okay.
But
Then,
what we know is actually what is interesting, probably also in regard to or in comparison to adults, is that teenagers often consume caffeine also in the evening, while adults avoid this.
Yeah, that was going to be my next question, actually, about sort of the timing of the caffeine. So that's interesting that they're still taking it late at night, still seeing these effects on their sleep.
So we do not have a lot of data, so I only actually know 1 or 2 surveys which look at the timing of caffeine intake in teenagers, but these surveys indicate that teenagers also consume caffeine in the evening.
Okay. And actually, just going back to the sort of findings of the study, did you find that the teenagers noticed a difference in their sleep sort of the next morning?
So on average, they indicated a worse sleep quality, particularly regarding the latency to fall asleep, or problems falling asleep. So they noted kind of that they had problems to fall asleep after caffeine compared to placebo. Yeah.
Okay. And was that reflected in how long it took them to get to sleep, sort of objectively?
No, this was not associated. Yeah.
That's interesting. Okay. But maybe it sort of reflects the kind of difference in their overall quality of sleep and how they felt about it.
Yes, I guess so. And I think it is also, I mean, it is quite hard, I think, to estimate the subjective sleep latency and then to also relate it to the objective sleep latency. So there is a lot of noise in subjective estimations. So this is probably a reason why it doesn't relate.
Yeah, absolutely. And then I was sort of wondering about your thoughts on how this can relate to sort of day-to-day life in the real world. Do you think that the impact of an accumulative use of caffeine, so the effect of daily use, will be different to obviously just this one time dose?
So this is a very interesting question. So this kind of relates to the question if the effects of chronic caffeine intake are different from the one we can observe after acute intake, so after intake after phase of abstinence. And as far as I know, there is no systematic investigation in teenagers addressing this issue. There are studies in adults which try to kind of disentangle these effects, and they suggest that the human brain or body adapts to the daily intake of caffeine, and that we do not show anymore these typical sleep disturbances during daytime intake as compared to one-time evening intake of caffeine right before bedtime after phase of abstinence, so that we kind of adapt to the daily intake. And in teenagers, I know that there has been one study where the authors, it was Apley and colleagues from the group of Rachel Huber, and they investigated slow effectivity in sleep in a group of habitually consuming teenagers and non-consumers, so a group difference. And there they still found that the habitually consuming teenagers reduced slow effectivity as compared to the non-consumers. So, and this in turn suggests that they probably do not adapt that fast, or probably simply do not adapt to these sleep disturbing effects of caffeine. But I mean, yes, it's simply an indication because we have the group differences here, and we do need to investigate this on a within subject design. Yeah.
Do we, just sort of following on from that, but do we have any information or idea why some teenagers perhaps are consuming more caffeine? Are there other factors that might be sort of playing into that potentially?
So there are a few studies investigating the motivation why they consume caffeine, and most often, so one popular reason is to enhance performance and to decrease sleepiness. So probably similar as in adults.
Yeah.
Yes.
So potentially they've already got disrupted sleep, so they're sort of feeding into that cycle. Okay. Great. So I think just sort of to wrap things up, what's the sort of next steps? Have you got plans for future studies to follow this up?
Yes, so what we are planning at the moment is a study where we investigate the effects of caffeine during sleep restrictions. So because we think that this mirrors more the conditions under which teenagers take caffeine and also under which teenagers live probably day by day. And this is what we now would like to focus on. And we also include not only vigilance measures or subjective sleepiness, but also decision-making and reward sensitivity tasks in order to also kind of get a broader view on what happens after caffeine intake.
Brilliant. Well, thank you so much for talking to us about your study, and I look forward to seeing what comes next.
Thank you.